Welcome back to the Family Ties podcast. This is Kelley, your host here. I am joined today by a very special guest who I'm honored to speak with, and I'm honored to share her with you all. I am here today with Marie Cohen, and she is I'll let her tell you about herself, but she is with the Child Welfare Monitor that I came across during some research for the Adrienne Jones case that I recently covered. So I'm going to hand it over and have Marie introduce herself. Thank you, Marie, for joining us today.
Okay, great. Thank you, Kelley, I'm still at a point where I get really excited when people find me and ask me to be on their podcast. So it'll probably always be that way. Yeah, so right, you were very charitable in saying I'm with Child Welfare Monitor. I basically am Child Welfare Monitor because it's a blog that I created about, about 7 years ago, 2015, after I left my job as a foster care social worker in the District of Columbia. And I guess I was really blessed because I was able, I had a very interesting career trajectory, which is that I didn't always know what I was going to do, but I decided that when I was a few years out of college and had a couple of different jobs, that my forte was really writing and research, and that I wanted to do policy so I could change the world, right? And at the time, and so I went to public policy school. I actually went to the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton, which has now changed its name and it's just the School of Public and International Affairs. But anyway, somehow it just worked out that I ended up basically being a person who did writing and research and produced reports. And none of the reports I produced ever seemed to be that made a difference. My idea was I'm going to make a difference. And at the time I thought I was going to end poverty, actually. So, and I just realized I'm kind of answering your next question, but hopefully it's okay. I could have said what Child Monitor is, but instead I'm giving you my whole life story and how I got into it. But so the long way around. So after I did that, after I went to public school, so I did some the jobs that I ended up having. The longest job I had was with GAO, which used to be called the General Accounting Office, but is now the Government Accountability Office. But they produce reports, about different government, to say how well is this program working or whatever. And I did other jobs like that. And it was just like, oh, all these reports aren't making any difference. So in the meantime, I spent a lot of time. I had 2 kids. I spent a lot of time I spent several years staying home with them. Then I kept on then I worked part-time for a while. Then I stopped working again to take care of my mother. And then it was like, I don't want to do this anymore. I want to do something that makes a difference. So that was when I decided to go back to school and become a social worker. And I had never actually worked in child welfare, but I had always really been interested in it. And I just took it into my head that I wanted to be a social worker in child welfare. So, that was what I ended up doing. And sadly enough, almost as soon as I started being a social worker, I realized that I was really a writer and a researcher, which my husband had tried to tell me a long time ago. But, I stuck it out for like 5 years and I learned a huge amount. And basically what I really wish, what would have been so much smarter, but hindsight is 2020, is to do the social work part first, because basically what I've done since then, so when going back to my original story that I interrupted, was that once I stopped being a social worker, because I won't tell you the whole story about how basically I was going to drop dead because I was 55 years old, and being a foster care social worker basically means you're being like a parent to, this caseload sounds unbelievably low. I only had like 10 kids that I was being a parent to, but when all of them need to go to the emergency room usually for suicidal thoughts or maybe homicidal, and you're the one who takes them to the emergency room because basically your jurisdiction doesn't want to ever make foster parents do anything because they don't want to ever lose the foster parents. So I'm the one who's bringing them all to the emergency room. Well, after like the seventh night and I'm 55 years old, I'm like, no, this isn't doable. And so my wonderful husband said to me, And I was like, well, what am I going to do now? Well, no one's going to, maybe now I want to do policy analysis and research again, but in child welfare. And I tried that, but no one wanted to hire me after so many years not doing that work. Who is this social worker? And my husband said, just write a blog, you don't have to make money. So I was so lucky. So that's what I started doing. I actually started doing it right after I left the job. And so it started out, it was really interesting. It has evolved, and even the platform and the name of it has evolved. At first it was called Fostering Reform, and it was on the Google blog app, which is really pretty amateur looking, and it was really about foster care in DC, and about all the experiences that I had that I thought were important for, people who care about policy. And what I was really, the kind of things I was really concerned about was the things like, in their desperation for foster parents, they were taking people who really just had no business being parents to anyone, who basically just wanted the money, even though I also met some of the most saintly, amazing people ever who were foster parents, but they couldn't afford to really dismiss the ones who really didn't have their hearts in the right place. And then the other thing was just the incredible, the way you spent like half your time documenting and responding, and also dealing with meaningless benchmarks that had nothing to do with helping your clients at all. So those were like my main themes. And then things changed. Then as I got more into it, I just started getting into other themes that had really concerned me long before I became a social worker. And those were some of the things that I write about the most now, like child protective services, and why do we always end up with these horrendous cases that you write about? Why do we have children killed by parents when they have been known to the system, and they've had cases, and they've been removed, and they've been returned? Why does that happen everywhere? Why does that happen over and over again? So I started getting into that a lot. I started to get into almost everything in the child welfare field, whether it's the fact that we have children in several states that are removed but have nowhere to go. So they're sitting in agency offices or hotels, or they're left in psychiatric hospitals. I started getting into the whole gamut. And eventually what happened was I changed the name. I decided I needed a nicer looking blog, and I found WordPress.com, and I found a new name because I wanted it to be broader than just foster care. So I called it Child Welfare Monitor, which I really like. I even paid someone to make a logo for me, which was like huge for me. Since I'm not getting paid anything, I just try to be bare bones about it. But and it's just been, I feel like it's only like in the past 2 years that I feel like it's really taken off with people. Somebody like you contacts me, probably like once a week, and often they're foster parents or they're advocates, or just it's really the people that I want to contact me. And it's just amazing. What is this blog? What is Child Welfare Monitor? I think the thing that holds it all together is that I take a child-centered perspective. That's how I define it, that the child should be the center. And that's how I put together all the things that I care about, because I feel like all the things that I'm talking about are what happens when the child isn't the center, when you worry about other things, whether it's too much focus on parents' rights, or your state is just too stingy and doesn't want to pay money, or there's too much focus on, you want to meet the standard. A lot of states have class action suits against them, so all they're focused on is like they have to meet the numerical standards. Whenever you lose sight of the children, things go wrong. So I feel like what I say about my blog, the way I define it is, it's a child-centered perspective on child welfare. And I don't see that in another blog. There are definitely other people who have written that way, who say they have a child-centered perspective, and do. And thank God there are people like that. But I do feel like it's unique because it's not popular right now. And I'm sure we're going to get into this. But right now, the perspective around the country is really parent-centered, and everything's all about parents' rights and how we're violating parents' rights. And, it's not that I'm against parents, but I feel like, the child should always, as soon as I became a parent, everything changed. I knew that my child came first. And even if it got to the point, this sounds crazy, but like if it got to the point that I wasn't good for my child, I mean, I would say, okay, and my child had to go to a foster parent and I knew I couldn't take care of them. A real parent would say, as a parent, I want the best parent for my child. You know what I'm saying? It's the best interests of the child. So I feel like if parents themselves should recognize, and parents advocates should recognize that children have to come first in society. They are the innocent and they're the helpless and they're the future, So I just feel like it's really important. And what's funny, I think if I had to say what's the second thing about my blog besides being child-centered, it ends up being sort of contrarian because the country is not child-centered right now. So I feel like almost anything that what I call the child welfare establishment says nowadays, I'm almost always against it. So, which is wild and crazy, because just off the top of my, just as an aside, I happen to be politically very liberal, a liberal Democrat, but often these are the liberal Democrats who are saying this, and I'm like, no, So I feel like I have become a contrarian just because of my child-centered perspective, and I think that's always helpful. So I guess that was a very, very long-winded answer to what is child welfare monitor. So it's a child-centered, somewhat contrarian blog where I try to go through, I'll just talk about whatever, maybe something just hit the news. Of course, it'll take me a couple of weeks to write about it. I can't just get it out right away. Or maybe, there's a new report that came out, or maybe it, right now I happen to be writing something that I'm very excited about, very depressed, but it's about a horrendous case that I don't know if you wrote about, but it's Harmony Montgomery in Massachusetts and New Hampshire. But the Massachusetts Office of Child Advocate, which is an amazing office, came out with a report. And I think it came out more than a month ago, but one of my partners in crime, one of my friends who's also kind of child-centered and contrarian said, have you seen this report? And it was like, oh yeah, I didn't read it. And I read it. I was like, okay, I've got to write about this, because the report actually made me realize, sometimes I'll just write about a report because like, this is a great report and I want everyone to know about it. But in this case, I actually found that I had a little bit of a different emphasis. And I felt like there were things maybe the child advocate didn't quite emphasize enough. And I feel like I really hit upon something this time, not to steal my own thunder, but I found that I had something really unique to say that the child advocate didn't say about this case. So, and now I've had some New Jersey foster parents contacting me out of the blue about having kids being reunified with their parents after being in foster care for 3.5 or 4 years, which is kind of what happened with Harmony Montgomery, so I have these people who are willing to talk to me without giving me their names, and I'm just so grateful. I'm just worried I don't want them to get in trouble, so that may be my next blog. But then someone just sent me an idea that I had thought of, which is, and I probably will get to that too, this horrible shooting in Texas. All I know so far is that the shooter's mother was a drug addict, and he was, I think, living with his grandmother, although mom may have lived there too. But, if child welfare had helped him out when he was little, maybe this would have never happened. I mean, child welfare is it's so fundamental, right? I mean, I wrote a few months ago about the woman who was on death row and pardoned at the last minute because she stole another woman's baby and cut it out of her stomach, murdered the other woman. And she was horrifically abused as a child, so it is so much is due to child abuse and neglect. So many of the problems we have, so it's a huge issue. Anyway, that was way too long-winded an answer. And I don't even know if I actually answered it. Did I?
You did, but I have 3 questions from like different points
yes.
of what you're saying, but most specifically to what you were just saying. I spoke with somebody last week, and I've made this wonderful, like through all of this work, I've made wonderful connections. You're a new wonderful connection that I'm really excited to make, but I won't say her name just because there's some ongoing issues. She's working on getting custody of her sister's children, and I don't want to in danger,
Sure.
anything of that nature. But she is a wonderful woman who reached out, and she was talking about how a majority, she was talking about this study. I forgot what the name of it is,
Okay.
where most prisoners and most people are on this scale of this test. Like they usually score a 5 to a 10.
So that's ACEs, right?
Yes.
Adverse childhood experiences. Yes, adverse childhood experiences. Yeah.
So when we talk about this topic in and of itself, we're talking about something bigger than just child abuse. We're talking about a lifelong issue that starts in the home that affects every aspect going from there. Whether it is your an individual's likelihood to commit crimes, become addicted to drugs or alcohol, or has that kind of life experience or is in prison, who doesn't score pretty high up on there. So that is a
Mhm.
huge indicator. And we're
Mhm.
talking about something that could impact our prison system, something that it could impact
Absolutely.
just everything
Right.
starting from that period of time, that childhood.
Absolutely. No question. No question about it. No question about it. Right.
So I
Yeah.
think it's
Yeah.
so important that we address this as a country and just see that if we were to focus on this one thing in a very serious way, we could positively impact all of these other areas and aspects of society. You know,
Right. 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 And we're so, our country, we're just very into like my home is my castle and we don't want to interfere. That's kind of a constant thing in our country. And so it's even harder than in some other societies, where it's just not natural to, it's just something Americans don't want to think about.
well,
Parents'
and
rights are really important.
when you were talking about how you as a parent, if came about that you weren't fit, that you would want your
Right.
child to be with somebody who is fit. I think
Right.
coming from a home where I was very physically and emotionally abused, there was a lot of mental illness involved. And so what I've learned about mental illness is that, it makes us kind of incapable. It
Right.
incapacitates us to see that we're the problem. And so
Right.
denial comes in, all of these
Right.
measures to defend oneself against,
Mm-hmm.
being called out for these things. And so when
Mm-hmm.
I look at this issue, this reminds me of so many issues. So I think it's become a dog whistle of a certain group of people who have a lot to hide. I tend to think it's an indicator. If somebody is against policy change, like all of these parents who get worked up by the HSLDA to go and protest when something comes about. I think it was in Hawaii a number of years ago. They were trying to pass a bill that just said if you have a criminal background or, sexual abuse or a violent sexual offense, you aren't going to be able to remove your kids from school and homeschool without some serious scrutiny. And the
Right.
amount of people that showed up
Oh,
to
it's
scream
incredible.
and yell about their rights, to me, that just shows that you have something to hide. Because if you are a parent like yourself who wants the best for your children and you're able to offer that, you're still able to say, I want my kid in the best situation possible. These other parents aren't capable of doing that because they know deep down that there's something off about their motivations or
Mhm.
the way that they practice it.
Right,
So
right.
I'm wondering if what you think about that. Like, do you think that parents? It's kind of like with gun rights. People think that if you're going to create stricter laws, like let's just make it as hard to get a gun as it is for you to get a vehicle. You have to register that vehicle. You have to have a driver's license. You have to take tests, and every year you have to register. And we accept that as a society. I don't feel like my rights are taken away to drive whatever vehicle I want because of those. That's just something that we have become accustomed to. So people who don't want, like, are you honestly saying you want all criminals to be able to get guns? So we're talking about something as basic as background checks. So these people who get so upset about their rights being removed, to me, it's a kind of key in that something's off.
Yeah. I mean, I don't claim to, I think you might be better able to say that to me. I don't claim to psychoanalyze those people, but yeah, they remind me. I think I've said it before. How do you pronounce HSL? How do you pronounce the homeschooling group? HLH?
HSLDA.
HSLDA, yeah.
Yeah.
I always spell it right. They do remind me more of NRA or the other gun rights people than any other. They really, really remind me of them. And I think one thing that they have in common, both those groups, is that they are single issue voters. Because I think one of the questions you gave me is like, how can we get as organized as them? The problem is, are we willing to be single issue voters? And that's the problem that they're obsessed with. Maybe they want guns too, God knows, but they're just like, and they will. Yeah, I've heard. I mean, that Hawaii thing is just one of many. I heard that one of the more recent ones. I don't know if you ever wrote about the Turpin case in California that was so horrible. They had like the 16 kids all locked up, and thank God those kids didn't die, but one girl escaped. And a legislator tried to do something so minor. I can't even remember what it was, but it couldn't get done. They just swarmed the state house, and it's impossible to do anything. So I think that is just a big problem. But of course, homeschooling is one group of parents that we're concerned about, but it's a different issue. Most of these horrible cases, they're not really in the quote homeschooling community. I mean, in some of them, the people have withdrawn their kids from school, the better to torture them with. Right. So the homeschooling, that's definitely a piece. But if we could address that and put in those types of controls, we would still have other cases. Because, and actually, now that you said that, that is just so incredible to me, because we've had horrific cases where the kids are going to school every day completely beaten up, and the teachers are calling, and they still don't get rescued by CPS. And I'm thinking specifically of Gabriel Fernandez, where they made in California, where they made a documentary, and his teacher was in court like crying, and she was saying to him, like, she knew, she just gave up, and he was a little boy, he was like 6, but old beyond his years, and she was saying to him, I guess you just have to wait till you grow up and you can leave this home. Well, he didn't have that time, So it is unbelievable that even kids who go to school and are seen at school to be beaten up or starving or are asking for food, they still don't get removed from these homes. So that's even more ridiculous. How can that possibly happen? I still don't understand that. Actually, I'll tell you a really funny story I'm sorry to say funny, but so I didn't tell my whole story about going back to school for social work. I was always, ever since I read the New York Times when I was growing up in New York, I would read about these cases. And there was one in New York called Elisa Izquierda many years ago. And I would always read about these cases where there was like this long history of abuse, but somehow the kid never got rescued, is my word, and they died. And so actually, when I did go back to school for social work, I actually wanted to be a CPS worker, the worker who goes to investigate those cases. And I thought Child Protective Services. I don't remember whether, I feel like my thinking was in two different directions. Sometimes I thought I would just know which homes were bad, so I would, quote, rescue these children. Sometimes I thought that by doing that work, I would then learn, how does this happen? Maybe I too would learn why you don't know. I would, so, but what happened was, so when I got out of social work school, I applied to the District of Columbia, where I live. I applied to Child and Family Services Agency. And actually, my biggest concern was I wanted to do what was needed. So I let them decide where to put me. And they did assign me to Child Protective Services. Well, there are a couple of interesting things about it. The first thing is, so the first day of training, they said, you're not here to rescue children. That was the first thing they said. So that's very common. You will see that if you look at anything that there's an organization called NEEKC, KC Family Programs, and you'll find that in their website over and over again, because they say this rescue mentality is very bad. It's like very superior. They often say it's racist, even though more than half the kids in that are removed are white, but around the country, but anyway, so that's a very unfashionable point of view. So that was number one, but that's not why I left. I still persisted, even being told I'm not rescuing children. But what ended up happening, and I won't bore you with this story, but the agency was such a difficult agency to work with. And I think there was also a lot of, I think there might have been age discrimination. All I know is there were a few of us who were older and none of us lasted. I didn't make it through the training because there was kind of a lot of harassment going on. It was just a very bad situation. So I ended up jumping to a private agency, but by working in a private agency, I couldn't do child protective services because that's all public in DC, and usually in most places, but not always. So I ended up doing foster care social work, and that ended up, as I said, all of them are hard. I mean, that ended up being really interesting, but I never got to have my experience knocking on doors. The only experience I had with it was as a trainee where I shadowed people, and that was interesting. So I never got to answer my question, how does this happen? So I still don't understand it. Well, I mean, I can understand. I mean, I think the basic problem is that people lie, right? Especially abusive or neglectful parents lie, right? So you're not going to be told the truth. And then you can't always trust children because if they're little, they may not even be verbal, or they may be scared and they'll lie with parents, or, who knows what. So you really don't have, you have to make a decision about who's telling the truth. So that's already, so yes, there are always going to be mistakes. I know that. I still haven't figured out why these wrong decisions happen so much. I mean, I still haven't, I think it's like this, there's this problem, and they talk about like the different kind of errors, right? And I'm just blanking on what the right term is, but there's the error where you don't remove the child, and in the worst case scenario, they die, right? Or they just continue being abused, and it's really horrible, right? But then the other error is you remove the child wrongly, and that's a very bad error too. I mean, you traumatize the child, and you traumatize the parents, and so both of those are really bad, and you can't prevent errors. They're going to be errors. So it is a very, very difficult job. I mean, I certainly don't have an answer to it, but I still haven't figured out why, when you read about some of these cases, it does seem very obvious that something very bad was going on, and yet the child's not removed. So I still haven't learned the answer. So why in those cases doesn't it happen? And I don't have the answer to it.
And I mean,
but I do
think,
yeah, go on. Yeah.
That's the thing, is that, I understand mistakes can be made, but, and this digs into a question I don't even know if I wrote down for you, but
Okay.
this is kind of is the thing that my brain is hung up on, is when
Okay.
you have CPS is involved, the child gets removed. We'll just use Adrian Jones as an example because that's fresh in my mind right now. But when he's taken from his mom's place for, her absence and, lack of care, it's just general negligence kind of
Neglect,
thing.
yeah. Mm-hmm.
And then sent to somewhere where they continue to get calls, hotline calls constantly. Right. They're involved at multiple different stages. And then they have the parents sign, something saying, just sign that you're not going to abuse this kid anymore.
Yeah, it's like safety
what
plan
on
problem.
earth at that point there is something that means to me like, okay, so the hang up is, in my mind, I think personally, you can correct me if you think I'm wrong, these bureaucracies, and I'm more left than you can go, so go to the left and then just keep going, and that's where I'm at. But when you get these bureaucracies where these unions are involved, and I understand the necessity of unions, I know the history on unions, but when a union makes it to where there are no repercussions, and that bureaucracy cannot be held accountable for anything that takes place, even when it's deaths, and they're able to cover these up, they're able to sweep them under the rug or not report them, or not even release information on it. That is when I start to think, okay, if people were afraid to lose their job, just like if I stole $5 out of the till, if I was working at the grocery store, I would be fired for that $5.
Right.
So when we have a system where there are no checks and balances,
Mm-hmm.
or you're overloading everybody and setting everybody up for complete failure from the start, but then there is no accountability, there is no serious repercussions. I think that is at the heart of this, is being held responsible for doing your job, because everywhere else I've ever worked, there are reviews, there are performance reviews.
Right. Right. Well, I assume they have them, but I'm sure they have performance reviews because I did, but I think that goes back to something I was talking about, that you're held accountable for things like whatever the agency is being held accountable for, which depends if they have like, a lot of states have class actions, and they're just looking at really specific things. Or like with CPS, it's often like, did you complete your investigations? Or, they're not the real things. Like, how many kids did you save? Well, you're not supposed to save kids.
Yeah, exactly.
But you're not held accountable for the right things. And I do agree with you, although I'll have to say a lot of people in the field say it's not about blame. They say, this is what a lot of people say, and I feel like I'm not a real expert because I haven't worked right in CPS, but they say, if you have an agency that's dominated by fear, that won't work very well. And maybe they say, I'm just trying to think, well, I think they also say, like, when it's dominated by fear, what'll happen is they'll just remove way too many kids, which often does happen after one kid is killed. But, anyway, a lot of the people in the CPS field who claim that they're like, they talk about safety science, and I'm not making a judgment one way or another because I'm not an expert, but they say that blame isn't the right thing, and that it's more about the opposite. We should take away blame, and that everyone should be able to be honest and learn from their mistakes. And I'm being just, I'm not sure what the answer is, but I do agree with you. I do think we have to have accountability. I do think, like, when the head of CPS resigns because something happens, I'm just not sure if that's really accountability, because they really didn't, unless they, it's probably, but I do think that if a worker made a really egregious mistake, I know it is really, really hard to have them be accountable. And I feel like only recently I read about like a case being dismissed. I mean, there are people who really knew and didn't. Now, I wish I had studied up on my cases. I'm trying to remember which case this was, whether it was Anthony. It might have been Gabriel Fernandez. It was really weird because, there were these 3 little boys in California and Los Angeles County, all in this one area, the Antelope Valley. And that was Anthony Avalos, Gabriel Fernandez, and Noah Quattro was the last. What was so great, 2 of them actually had like the same, there's so few services in the area, they actually had like the same agency with mental health services and like the same worker, but like one of these workers, and I can't remember who was that, but some of the social workers were brought to court, and I think the cases were dismissed, and they were like so relieved. And I thought, how can you relieved? I mean, I would have just killed myself if I should have known and didn't know. I'm always amazed by people who like kill someone or do something really awful, and then you see them in court when they're let off, or and they're like, oh, I'm so relieved. And I'm like, I would be saying, kill me. Yeah. Or I just don't get how people can live with themselves. But I do think we need accountability. I don't know to what extent that is enough. One thing that I have really been thinking about more and more, well, there's one thing I've been thinking about a lot, and I haven't quite been able to figure this out. There are a whole bunch of other cases that don't arise in the context of child welfare, but they arise in the context of child custody, where you have parents, and then there's this thing, you have parents who are fighting over custody, and there's this thing, divorced parents, where now it's almost impossible not to give parents shared custody, even if one of them, usually the dad, but not always, is an abuser, and then the judge lets the dad have unsupervised visits, and the dad kills the child, and these judges, when you read about how they treated the moms often, and then how can they like go to sleep at night, and then you hear nothing happens to them. And then, and this occurs in child welfare as well. Yeah, we're there. But usually I feel like the judges listen to the agency. So I don't blame the judges as much, but that's not always the case. I've had cases where judges contradicted me, and it was usually in that parents' rights direction. Yeah. So, but
that's at the heart of this, though, the fact that the whole goal of most child protective services is, at least to my understanding, is that the goal is not to, like you said, save children. It is to keep the family unit together at all
Together, right,
costs.
right. Well, that's what that is definitely the mood now, the culture now. So, if you look at what are the goals of child welfare, most people, kind of the standard goals that they'll teach you in social work school or at the agency is like safety, permanency, and well-being, and they have definitions. But what ends up happening is, like, right now, everyone will tell you that reunification is the preferred. I mean, reunification has always been the preferred goal, but the problem is if it can't be done, like how long are you going to try it, and how prejudiced are you going to be? How much are you going to blind yourself to the fact that it's not going to work, And so, yeah, I think the emphasis is too much now on reunification at all costs, like I say, or don't remove the child at all, And I feel like it's just too much. It's just going too far over to that side. But, child welfare is famously a pendulum, which does go back and forth. And often when there is a death, it goes too far on the other side. That's what I've been told in the past. Although and I think that's often a local phenomenon, like in a local area, if there's been a death, then that might happen. But I feel like nationally for the past quite a few years, it's been definitely in favor of parents' rights. And that has been, it's just gone too much over to that area. And just the whole things that I've written about, the whole philosophy, and most agencies have what they call practice models, and the practice model is nowadays I've written about this in numerous states, is usually about family strength, that you should be emphasizing the family strength and not their weakness. I mean, that's all well and good. If you're working with a family, if you're working with a family and you hope they'll reunify, you definitely want to notice their strengths and build on their strengths and tell them their strengths, but you can't just shut your eyes to the dangers to the child. And, so sometimes it just gets too extreme. So there was a case, and now I'm getting them all mixed up. There's a case I wrote about recently. I think this was Noah Quattro, where one of the workers, there were like more than one worker involved, because there was an in-home case and there was an in-home worker, but there was a CPS worker, and the CPS worker was like, we have to, or maybe the supervisor, you have to look at the family strength. You have to look at them, and don't keep looking at their weaknesses. And it's like, well, the kid died because they didn't look at their weaknesses. I mean, there's a certain point where you have to say, let's save the child, so it's just, it can be very, this is really serious. Children should come first. Children are little and they're vulnerable and they can't protect themselves, especially if they're little. So
you had just mentioned, like, in divorce cases, and
yeah,
the same, whatever you had just said was exactly what happened to me and my siblings, just in reverse. So my and this is what kills me, is that social services was called on my mom multiple times, couldn't get in the home because of HSLDA. The only time they were able to get in the home was after I had left for college. My two younger sisters were still living at home. I would go home every weekend just because I was afraid for their safety, and regardless of how it felt, like I was going to go home and be with them.
Oh my gosh.
And my dad, I see him as complicit in all this, but during his divorce with my mom, all of us older kids went in and testified in court, which was extremely, it's tough when you're seeing a family already, torn apart, but to go in and have to testify, like, yes, this is not a safe home for them to be in. We would like our dad to have custody. And that's an odd thing. That's usually not the request.
Right.
And it was one of those things where, no one wants to go in because you still love your parents.
Right.
I love my mother, but it's like, it's heartbreaking to be in there and be like, that this person also needs help really badly, but there's only so much that you can do.
Right.
And just seeing that, my dad ended up getting custody, but my
good.
sister actually shared custody. She had custody of my youngest sister for several years, and like I can tell just a total difference, in the two youngest.
That's so great. And I do feel bad. I shouldn't have even said that about mom, because I just read today about, I just read today about a case where the mom was just totally mental. I mean, she was just totally insane, and she killed a child. I mean, dad, it was some, wait, was it, I'm trying to remember which case it was, but anyway, it was a case where the dad um, was desperately trying to get custody because he knew the children were in danger with the mom. So it definitely happens. Definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's
Well,
just,
and I think the reason that it shouldn't have to get to that point, because it's like all you should have to see is that CPS was called on this person several times to know that there's a problem that you should
right,
look into.
right,
And the fact
right.
that I should never have had to go in and testify, I should never have had to put myself through that. And because I don't want to pick sides, both of them failed in really epic ways.
Hmm.
So it's not about taking sides, it's about trying to save lives. And I think it's hard when you see the system want to not listen to kids. It's kind of like the whole hashtag Me Too thing. It's like
Yes.
if I had felt like I could trust someone as a child, I already knew I wasn't going to be believed. I never sought help because I just knew there was no out for me. And parents have every reason to lie and manipulate the situation because, they
Hmm.
have something to lose. They don't want to be in trouble. And I think, kids, even nonverbal kids, we need to take the time to sit with them, to watch how they interact with others, and just really do some deep dive into the well being of the kid. And I mean, that's the whole thing, is like this system is supposed to be there to save kids. And if that's what they're telling
They're
new
telling
recruits and new
you.
hires, I think you're setting them up for failure.
Absolutely. I know it really. Can you imagine? I went back to school to save kids, and then the first thing they told me
Now,
is I'm not supposed.
if CPS, and I could be really off on this, but I had been interested in being an agent of some kind, being somebody boots on the ground. And I saw,
Hmm.
A, they don't make any money. And B, where
Hmm.
I was looking, I think I was originally looking in Kentucky when I was still
Oh,
there.
okay.
And
Oh,
they
they really don't make money there. Yeah.
don't make any money. And the guidelines was that I would need to go back to school to get not a master's, but like a whole other. I'd already been going to school since 2006, but having to get a special degree in childcare.
Right. So oh, really, yeah, usually it's social, it's funny. Some people think it's really important to require education, you know, specialized education for social workers. So like DC required a master's in social work, and that's considered like very progressive. There are some states that maybe don't require anything. I don't know if there are any that don't require a college degree, but generally it's considered to be good if they require more education and more specialized education. I mean, I wasn't incredibly impressed with social work school, to be honest with you, but it probably is. It probably is a good thing, I think, to require some degree of specialized education. I don't know if it needs to be a master's or whatever, but yeah, I did go back to school just to do that. Yeah.
You
So
have cops who are out there, out on the
yeah,
streets with guns, with
right.
chip on their shoulder,
Ah,
and free
yes.
reign, and no education really required for that.
Yeah,
I mean, they do
yeah, yeah.
on-site training, but
Right.
in my mind, we're severely understaffed. We don't have enough
Mhm.
people in these positions. I mean, people are overloaded with casework.
Yeah.
They're juggling too many cases to give that
Right.
child, each
Exactly.
one, the correct amount of attention. So
Right.
it seems to me like if you wanted to overhaul the system, part of it comes down to offering training for new recruits.
Yeah.
You want people who've had a background and know the signs to look for. Someone like
Right.
me who's like, hey, I know that this from the outside,
Right.
my family looked amazing. My family
Yeah.
looked like the model homeschool family, but everything
Right.
underneath was a complete sham and lie.
Right.
And
Right.
all you
Right.
have to
Right.
do is just really look. Kind of like with the Coalition for Responsible Home Education.
Yeah.
They want
Yeah.
people to volunteer who have had a background in homeschooling, whether
Yeah.
it be a positive or
Yes.
negative experience, to bring that expertise and knowledge into it and be like, hey, this is my experience and this is where I see there's some real change needed. If you
Right.
opened up something like that to people who may not necessarily have that education
Right.
or
Right.
the
Right.
money
Right.
to go and invest in more
Yeah.
education,
Yeah. Yeah.
I would think that you would want to train people as they come to you and be like, this is
Hmm.
how to look for this. This is what we're looking for. And you train,
Right, right.
you know,
Maybe that would be a good idea to be more flexible about what the training is required. I never really thought about that, but
same thing with
yeah.
trade schools. Like if you know that you're somebody who higher education isn't necessarily for you, you don't want to go
Mhm.
into a lot of debt. Trade schools, I mean, in a lot of other countries, they do education way better than we do here in the States anyway.
I
But
know. I totally agree with you. Yeah, yeah. Well, that's an interesting idea that I'd like to think about more. There is one program that's pretty good, but I think it might be only at the master's level. I'm not sure. There's a program with Title 4E, which is the program that funds foster care on the federal level, and now it funds more than foster care. It funds like in-home services. But there's a program under Title 4E that pays for it. I can't remember exactly how it works, but I thought of applying to it. It pays for graduate school in social work if you're going to do child welfare, and then you have to do child welfare for a certain amount of time. And I think my husband convinced me not to do it because he said, "What if you hate it or whatever?" But I could have done it because I did for 5 years. I think that was enough time. But that's kind of a good idea. Maybe something like that could be expected because it may be only for masters. I'm not sure. But you may be right that, I'm just not sure. You may be right that the education requirements are too stiff, but sometimes you hear people saying, "Oh, what can you expect?" Like, "Oh, it's Kentucky." Oh, but you said Kentucky does have a requirement. Sometimes there are states that don't, like, anyone can go get these jobs, and they'll say, "Well, no wonder, they're doing such a bad job."
yeah,
So I don't know. They somehow think that, oh, if you get people with a master's degree, they must be more qualified. That may not be true. So,
I mean, if you're not going to pay somebody, and it's kind of like I've read this book recently called The Nordic Theory of Everything, and it's
oh, sounds
really
interesting.
eye opening about how much we've been sold on this myth here in the States that we're all about the family and we love life, and we value familyhood and children and babies, but
Mhm.
these other countries that are just doing it better and making sure that you're set up for success to be there and be a present parent. Same thing goes with having the resources there. So, like teachers, it's different. If I said I want to be a teacher here in the States, it just means that I'm going to be set up for a lot of stress, okay,
Oh,
class
absolutely.
overload, and then, just being burnt out
Absolutely.
at the end of the day and not
Ab-
even being respected for it. Whereas
right.
in countries, like Finland or Sweden, it's like it's a job that you want. That's a well respected job that pays well and it invests in, they give great education. So when you make people happy in their jobs, they do great things. They're freed up to do great things.
You and I are on the same wavelength. I was just writing in an email that I want to move to Finland or Sweden.
Yeah, yeah. Finland for me, I'm ready. Let's go.
The person I was writing to originally is from Russia. Said Finland has 6 weeks of winter, 6 months of winter. I'm like, all right, bring it on. It is interesting. I mean, that places that are more north, even in the United States, Vermont and Massachusetts, New Hampshire, they do tend to have better indicators, social, less teen pregnancy, less. Although I don't know, that might have gotten changed with the opioids because some of those states have had really bad opioids. So I don't know, but in general, or Minnesota as well, they tend to have better social indicators, and so I don't know what it is, but anyway.
I mean, it
Yeah.
speaks to this whole thing of it's clear that child welfare needs to be reformed, overhauled, and reformed completely from the ground up. I mean, I also think that about our government right now as well. But you can't do everything at once. Is it even feasible? Is it possible?
Right.
Because of the people who are making these decisions,
Right.
putting a child first. I mean, if we are a country that cares about life so much, why does that life cease to matter once it's been born? And
Right.
why can't we have people as worked up about this as they are about something that isn't even formed yet? I am just baffled.
Me too. I'm totally baffled, so don't come to me for an answer. Yeah, that one I just don't get it. Yeah. I think one thing about our issue is people don't want to hear about it. It upsets them, right? If you tell them about Adrian Jones, they don't want to hear about it, and that's part of the problem. I was thinking about, yeah, can it be fixed? I think that part of the problem, and this relates to the Nordic countries too, like child abuse and neglect, it's not just a problem of poor people, obviously, but it's definitely correlated with poverty. It's more extreme. And so it gets caught up. So CPS, child welfare services, are mostly serve poor people. And I feel like all the services in our country that are mostly poor people, that are mostly for poor people, are really terrible. They're underfunded. They're completely a mess, and they're not the best. People don't want to go into them. You don't get the best in the bright. You don't get the Bill Gates is going into that, so it's just such a huge problem. I think that is part of the difference with the Nordic countries. And now I really want to read that book because they are much more generous. Europe in general, I mean, Western Europe in general is more generous, more egalitarian, and they're willing to tax people more so that you can have better services. So I think that is part of the problem. The question is, to what extent is money the problem? And I feel like money is definitely part of the problem. Some people say, like, there's a very famous child welfare scholar who recently died, whose name is Richard Gellis, and he wrote this book, Out of Harm's Way. And he, in his last book, I wrote a review of it, and he said it's really not, he's one of the people who wants a child-centered system, and he wrote about it. He said money isn't the issue. We just need to shift the mindset to a child-centered system. And I don't think that's enough, because I think, if people have a caseload of that is just unmanageable, then they can't make good decisions. But maybe, I just don't know, maybe we're just wasting so much money. I mean, one of the things that irritated me so much when I was working in foster care is when they would keep hiring more people who were not what we called case carrying social workers. There were always more and more people on top of, we had to go, people who would be reviewing our cases, or people who were specialists in this or a specialist in that. And that's true in education too, by the way. They're always hiring more central office people. And maybe if you could revamp it, maybe it could be done with the same amount of money. I just don't know. And then the more you have these class action suits, and the more you have these standards that are supposed to make things better, but that's more need for people who are calculating, did you meet the standards, and people who are overseeing, people who are reviewing. And it's just, so it's such a complicated problem with so many moving parts. Mm-hmm. That I don't know if we can fix it, and I don't know how we can fix it. I do know, I feel like we have to put children first. We have to, especially in the systems that we know where the social workers are just drowning in work. And, usually, eventually there are some states this year that have just, because they're having the Great Resignation, they just, they are starting to put more money in, probably not enough. I was just reading about the Illinois governor, like Illinois, their child welfare head has all these he's been held in contempt of court 10 times. And I don't know if it's fair or not. I mean, what can he do? And they've been, and now the legislators are saying, we've been putting in more money, and why isn't anything happening? I don't know. How do you make these things change? I just don't know. I don't have an answer. I just feel like I'm out there just trying to fight against all these people who are trying to move it in the wrong direction, because there's all these people, that, and I guess maybe I should have said that in the beginning, that my goals have sort of changed over the 7 years I've been doing this, because now I see myself as like holding the line. There are now all these people who want to eliminate child welfare. There's this upend movement. I don't know if you've heard about it. And it's got all tied in to the anti-racism and the police reform movement, which seems really strange to me, because now it's like it's like the police, and it's racist, and so we have to abolish it. And it's like, wait a second, like the little girl I'm writing about now was white. I happen to do local child advocacy, and most of the kids we're talking about in DC that are abused and neglected do turn out to be Black, because there's such a correlation, I think, with neglect with poverty. And, it's a complicated story. These so-called anti-racism people, what they're really saying is that I should leave this Black child at home to get murdered, and that because that, I feel like that's what they're ultimately saying, because for whatever reason, Black children are 3 times more likely to get killed by their parents. And that is probably the result of hundreds of years of racism and slavery and the whole history of Jim Crow and everything. But what ended, because of, and the trauma history of families for 200 years. And there's so many things that led to this. But given that we're at the situation now, is the answer then to just let Black parents who are traumatized and maybe drug addicted and maybe mentally ill, just let them have free reign over their children and don't quote save them because you don't want a white social worker or a Black social worker saving Black children? I mean, I just have trouble with that,
I have to find the title to this book. It's African American author Stacey Patton.
I've written about her. You know what?
One
of the things I hate about blogging is that there's not a really good way to see. I don't know how to have my blogs like so that you can see them all by topic, and so that I wrote Stacey Patton's amazing, right? And she's one of the few Black people, and she has a whole movement. I mean, she's against corporal punishment. It's really interesting. Yeah, she feels strongly, and she has a whole argument, about why. And I reviewed her book, and she liked my review, and I basically was very, very positive about her book. I feel like she almost, though, is too hard on Black parents, because I think that on surveys and stuff, the differences aren't that big between Black and white parents on corporal punishment, but it could be that it just gets more out of hand in some Black families because of all the other things that are going on. But anyway, that is her cause, because she cares about Black children, because she was one of those Black children who was beaten and didn't get, she had to kind of beg. I think at one point she got removed, and she had to beg them to keep her removed. I mean, they wanted to send her back, Yeah. So
I read her, that Mean Old Yesterday is the one that I read. And I was
wait, what is it that you said? What is it that you read?
That Mean Old Yesterday by Stacey Patton.
I haven't read that. That Mean Old Yesterday. Oh, is that an article or a book?
It's a book. And
okay, because I read Spare the Kids.
Why? That's the next one that
I didn't read that Mean Old Yesterday. That's like her memoir, I think. Okay,
yeah.
I'll have to read.
And I was just so taken by it because, I mean, it reminded me a lot of my childhood. So I do believe there is a lot of crossover with Black and white families and then with poverty. But I think the one thing, it comes down to education. When you have people who are raised in these systems like she was, like I was, where it's like spare the rod, that kind of thing, where corporal punishment, beatings, just the most heinous types of corporal punishment, and how parents encourage each other, or they find it to be some kind of funny thing. Like,
yes, she makes me aware about that. She tweets about it and writes about it, that they put it on social media. Really horrible things that I was totally unaware of. I'm just not privy to those things. Yeah.
So I think it comes down to education is the solution to this. Putting programs, I mean, then you're missing all the homeschool kids, but regardless, putting programs into place where kids they have a class where they learn about just everyday life. What's acceptable? If you're being touched like this is unacceptable. You have every right to not like that and to talk to somebody. Here are the resources for you if this is happening. Do not be afraid. Empowering kids to know what's not normal within the home, no matter how bad they may think they are as kids, to observe it, instilling them with the value of like being hit. That's not okay. I don't have to accept that.
Right. I was going to say, I think there's a lot of that good touch, bad touch, but the being hit, no, because that's too controversial. And there are a bunch of states, that maybe Kentucky, that still allow the schools educators to hit kids. And it's like really controversial. So it's just, I think that would be good. But unless you make corporal punishment, in most states, there's a distinction between corporal punishment and child abuse. Like it has to leave marks or whatever, so you don't want to convince kids that they have to go call the hotline and then they'll get a real beating because it turns out they're not child abuse. So we have to be careful, and this is still controversial, so we don't want to get kids in worse trouble. But I think that people like Stacey, I think she's working with people around the country. There is a growing movement, I think, to ban corporal punishment, and I think it might be getting stronger. And I just heard a really interesting talk. It was a local forum on domestic violence and child abuse, but they had this really great pediatrician who works on this anti-corporal punishment movement around the country. And he said that one thing that's taking hold around the country now is no hit zones. And they can be anywhere, but it's especially taking root in children's hospitals and emergency rooms, because I have heard this. I know a children's ER doc, and he says people are hitting their children in the ER, and I don't think DC has it, but they have signs saying no hit. But it's more than that. They train the staff to like talk to the parents. And if the parents say, well, this is the only way I can keep the kid under control, then they might have like packets to give them with information and also like activities for the kid. So, I mean, that's not going to change the whole thing, but things like that, I think this movement is growing. And one thing that made me more optimistic on a very depressing day. It was like maybe 2 weeks ago when I heard this guy before the latest shooting, but he was reminding me that progress has been made in our society. We ended slavery, we ended Jim Crow. I do think things are getting better on the civil rights front, although some people say no. Then we had progress with gay and lesbian rights for sure. And what else was he saying? There was another one, but anyway, progress is being made. So maybe that is what is changing values, because if we did something about corporal punishment, that is very tied up with physical abuse, I think, because I think things that start with corporal punishment end up, being physical abuse. So I think that would definitely be a good thing. And I know
if you're
Stacey
raised in that environment, you tend to, like me, I bought it hook, line, and sinker my whole life.
Right.
Everything up until the point I moved away, and then I went to college and started to really dramatically question things. I'm reading this book, Why Do I Do That? On defense mechanisms. And he said something that jumped out at me. And he basically says that, as with like other things like rickets, when there's a failure to rectify deficiencies, it'll lead to permanent damage. So basically, the brains of babies whose parents consistently let them down emotionally will reflect that damage for life.
Right.
And
exactly.
primarily in the areas of self-worth and the capacity to connect emotionally with
Mm-hmm.
So
Absolutely.
when people have kids, it's kind of like we have all these other rules and regulations for, like I said, vehicles. But because we want people to have kids so badly, we are not educated. I'm not saying that you should have to have a license to have a kid, but you should kind of have to go through some kind of training.
Right.
Everybody is created with this tool.
I know. That used to be said a lot more. I was just gonna say it to you, but I didn't know you're so much younger than me. I didn't know if you had ever heard that. But they used to say it more, but it was always kind of more in a, like, I'm not saying you have to pass a test to have kids, but ... There should be something. But what is the something? Because in this country that values freedom to bear arms and do whatever you want to your kids, maybe teaching it in school. I don't know.
Back around to education. For me, with my brain, everything I keep doing keeps circling back around to, well, if you can't overhaul this system right now, what can you actually actionably do right now to at least instill values in the future? The future parents are these kids. So whatever their home lives look like, being able to tell them what is acceptable, make them feel like they have someone they can go to, who will listen to them and trust them and investigate, I think is really important. And letting them know I shouldn't be hit if I irritate mom for something. Instilling these values, because as they grow older and then they go to have kids, we typically just mimic what we grew up. And I think that's a lot of what Stacey Patton talks about, is that it's not necessarily that there's just this group of people who are just bad and it's just, Black parents who want to beat on their kids. It's a universal thing, and it's a generational thing as well. So like my parents and how they were treated by their parents, it's like they're just replaying, they're acting out these roles that they saw or that they experienced. And so if we can change those dynamics, we have the potential to save the future, even if we can't fix this bureaucracy over here at the moment.
Possibly, maybe that is more the way to look at it. I have a couple other sort of like really far out ideas that I have written about that I'll just throw out to you just to see if you think you just put in on your back burner. There are a couple of things that I've thought about that are not usually brought up in this context. One of them is that a lot of these Nordic countries they have very well-developed systems of childcare / preschool education, and that I love the idea of taking. I mean, I really want it to be like educational childcare, but making it available to everyone way earlier, not just pre-K like they're talking about now, but I think that is one of the best anti-maltreatment mechanisms. We don't have really good research on it, but there's so many pathways by which high quality childcare or preschool can help. And one of them is my favorite, which is hated by some of the other people, but the surveillance part. So if they're looking, that's another set of eyes on the kids, and the littlest kids are the most vulnerable. So if they're going, but again, homeschoolers aren't going to buy this, right? There's at least one preschool in DC that is specifically designed for very high risk kids, and they check them for marks every day. So, so they're really checking. But even if not, so that's one mechanism. But another mechanism is these high quality preschools may have a lot of interaction with the family. They may have educational events. They may have home visits. So there are specific programs like, I think, Early Head Start that combines like home visiting. So then you get the parent education combined with the surveillance. And then there are like other, let's see, what did I think now I'm blanking on it, but there are other aspects of it also. It's like it gets at it in several different ways. So that's like one thing. I have a plan that I think I'm going to start, I do some advocacy here in DC, and I think I'm going to start testifying every year. Instead of like, I give this very diffuse testimony, this is what's been happening. I'm going to say, listen, when a family, more and more families now, they don't remove the kids, but they open a case for in-home services. And often it's really not much. They're just kind of keeping an eye on the family. And then they say, oh, you're doing great. They close the case, right? If all those families got free, really high quality childcare, that I would think that would be an amazing thing. So I think I might, of course, things will probably come up that I'll have to testify on, but I was thinking that maybe I'll just keep devoting my testimony, because these people on the city council actually started to listen to me, which is amazing. So if I keep saying, could you just do this, just put money on the budget for this, maybe it'll happen. So that's like one idea. I remember in one of my blogs, I quoted that the research shows that it has an impact, that high quality childcare / early childhood education has an impact on child maltreatment. I don't know if it's really strong data, but I think that would be worth looking at.
I know I've talked your ear off, so I won't keep you any longer, but I am hoping that we can continue this dialogue.
Yes.
It's brought up so many other questions along the way.
And I've had a great time talking to you. I could talk to you forever. Maybe sometime I'll meet you when I go to Colorado, because
that would be amazing.
Yeah.
Specifically, would you tell everybody where to find your work?
Well, find my blog. So it's really easy. You can just Google Child Welfare Monitor, MONITOR, and then you will find my blog. But it actually is just childwelfaremonitor.org, so you can do that. But Google. But now that I've been doing it for so long, it will come up on Google. Yay!
Yay! Thank you so much, Marie, for taking the time out of your day to talk with me and listen to some of my crazy ramblings and ideas. But I'm really happy that there are people out there like you who do care about this issue and who do, amazing work on your own time to bring awareness to this. So thank you very much. I appreciate it, and I appreciate all you do.
Well, thank you, Kelley. And I could say everything right back at you. I admire what you're doing. You're doing it on your own time with the job. I mean, you're amazing. And I'm grateful that you found me, and I had a great time talking to you. And anytime, and let's just stay in touch. Okay.
We will. Well, you have a wonderful day. Thank you so much.
A wonderful weekend.
Take care.
All right. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.